The barn erupted in orange fury against the Wyoming night, casting dancing shadows across Emily Rowan's soot-streaked face as she pressed her shoulder against the splintering wooden door. Inside the inferno, her 12-year-old son Jacob clutched 9-month-old Samuel to his chest, the baby's wails cutting through the roar of flames like a blade through her heart. "Mama." Jacob's voice cracked with terror as burning timber crashed around him. "I can't get out." Emily threw her full weight against the barricade, her hands blistering as she clawed at the smoldering planks. Through the smoke, she could see the silhouettes of masked riders disappearing into the darkness, but not before one had turned back to shout words that chilled her blood. "Should have signed them papers when you had the chance. Widow woman, railroad money, don't wait for nobody." The memory struck her like a physical blow. Thomas, just 3 months ago, sitting in that same barn, gently bouncing Samuel on his knee while humming an old cavalry tune. "Don't you worry, little man," he had whispered to their feverish baby. "Papa's here. Papa will always keep you safe." Now Thomas was dead, and she was failing the promise he could no longer keep. The noose swaying from the cottonwood beside her house told the rest of the story. This wasn't random violence, it was business. Cold, calculated business that saw her children as acceptable losses in the race for railroad gold. "Don't you let my babies burn." Emily screamed at the empty night, grabbing Thomas's splitting axe from the woodpile. The heat seared her face as she swung wildly at the barricade, each blow driven by desperate maternal fury. Sparks showered down like hellish snow, and somewhere in the distance she could swear she heard laughter echoing from the hills. Samuel's cries were growing weaker. Jacob was coughing now, violent hacking sounds that made Emily's blood run cold. She had seconds, maybe less, before the smoke claimed them both. "Hold on, my loves," she whispered through gritted teeth, raising the axe one final time. "Mama's coming." The blade bit deep into the burning wood, and suddenly the barricade gave way in a shower of sparks and flame. Emily lunged forward, snatching her sons from the jaws of death as the barn roof collapsed behind them in a thunderous roar. But as she knelt in the dirt, holding her children close and watching her livelihood burn, Emily Rowan knew with crystal clarity that this was only the beginning. The men who had done this wouldn't stop until they had her land or her life. The war for Bitter Creek had begun. 3 months earlier, Emily Rowan had been the wife of Thomas Rowan, respected rancher and pillar of the Bitter Creek community. She had been mother to 2 boys and keeper of the finest farm in Carbon County, where Sweetwater ran year-round and soil so black it looked like God's own handiwork stretched across the richest valley in Wyoming territory. Then Thomas had been found dead beside Devil's Canyon, trampled by his own horse in what Sheriff Coleman Briggs called a tragic accident. But Emily knew better. Her husband had been the finest horseman in 3 counties. He wouldn't have been thrown by any animal, least of all his beloved mare, Patience. Now she stood at his graveside, watching dirt rain down on the coffin while the vultures circled. Not the kind with wings, the kind with pale eyes and soft hands who smelled opportunity and fresh grief. Terrible loss, Mrs. Rowan. Jeremiah Blackwood murmured beside her, his thin frame draped in expensive black wool. The banker's voice carried something beneath practiced sympathy, a satisfaction barely concealed behind funeral courtesy. Thomas was irreplaceable, in more ways than one. Emily's jaw tightened at his tone. Yes, he was. Of course, running such a large operation alone. Well, that's a burden no woman should bear. Blackwood's pale eyes drifted over the assembled mourners, good people mostly, but people who owed him money or depended on his goodwill. "I'd be happy to discuss your options. Perhaps we could meet soon, say tomorrow afternoon." Perhaps not. Emily's voice carried enough frost to make several nearby mourners glance her way. Blackwood's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "I do hope you'll reconsider, Mrs. Rowan. Time has a way of complicating situations that could be resolved simply." The funeral reception at the church proved even more trying. Emily found herself surrounded by neighbors who spoke in hushed tones about her difficult situation and the challenges facing a woman alone. Everyone seemed to have advice, but no one offered genuine help. "Emily, dear." Martha Donnelly approached with forced brightness, her plump face creased with what appeared to be genuine concern. Martha ran the general store with her husband and had been Emily's closest friend for 7 years. "How are you managing, really?" "We're surviving." Emily shifted Samuel to her other arm, noting how the baby's skin felt warm despite the cool September air. "Taking things one day at a time." "Well, if there's anything we can do." Martha's voice trailed off as her husband appeared at her elbow, his expression stern and somehow fearful. "Martha, we should be getting back to the store," Patrick Donnelly said curtly, not meeting Emily's eyes. "Mrs. Rowan, our condolences." Emily watched them hurry away, noting the whispered conversation that followed. She was beginning to understand her new reality, widow of a man with valuable land, mother of children she could barely support alone, and increasingly isolated from a community that had once embraced her family. Touching service. Sheriff Briggs drawled from behind her, his voice carrying the slight slur that suggested he'd been sampling the communion wine. Thomas was well-liked, that's for sure. Of course, being well-liked don't always translate to being well-protected in this territory. Emily turned to face the sheriff, noting the calculated menace in his small, dark eyes. Briggs was a thick-necked man with scarred knuckles and a reputation for settling disputes with violence rather than law. "Is that supposed to mean something, Sheriff?" "Just making conversation, Mrs. Rowan. Though I do hope you'll be careful. A lot of dangerous elements around these parts. Accidents happen to folks who don't take proper precautions." His hand rested casually on his gun belt. "Especially folks who might be too proud to accept good advice from their betters." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Emily felt ice forming in her stomach as she realized the depth of the conspiracy beginning to form around her family. That evening, after putting the boys to bed in their farmhouse kitchen, Jacob on a pallet near the stove, Samuel in his cradle, where she could watch his labored breathing, Emily sat at Thomas's desk, trying to make sense of their finances. The numbers told a grim story. Thomas had been carrying significant debt, much of it tied to land improvements and equipment purchases she didn't remember him making. The mortgage payments to Blackwood's bank were higher than she recalled, and there were mysterious charges for services she couldn't identify. As she puzzled over the ledgers, her fingers found something wedged behind one of the desk drawers, a folded letter in Thomas's handwriting yellowed with age. The words that caught her eye made her blood run cold. "The children's screams still wake me at night. I pray God will forgive what we did at Sand Creek. But I know I never can." Sand Creek. The name hit her like a physical blow. The massacre that had horrified even a frontier, hardened to violence, hundreds of Cheyenne and Arapaho killed mostly women and children in what newspapers called a battle. But everyone knew had been butchery. Emily's hands trembled as she refolded the letter. Thomas had never mentioned military service, had always claimed to be a territorial surveyor before they met. Their entire marriage had been built on a lie. But what kind of lie and why? She was still wrestling with this revelation when she heard horses outside. Emily extinguished the lamp and moved to the window, peering through curtains at 3 riders silhouetted against moonlight. They sat motionless at the edge of her property for nearly an hour, making no sound, but sending a clear message: you are being watched. The harassment began in earnest the next week. Emily's fences were cut during the night, allowing her cattle to wander onto neighboring land, where they were impounded for trespassing. When she went to retrieve them, she found half her herd had been sold to pay the fines. Her well, which had never run dry in 14 years, suddenly began producing brackish water that sickened the remaining animals. Tools disappeared from her barn. Her vegetable garden was trampled by unknown visitors who left no tracks but accomplished their mission of destruction. Emily tried to maintain normal relations with the town, taking Jacob to school and shopping at Donnelly's store as she always had. But the reception grew colder each week. Conversation stopped when she entered rooms. Children were pulled away from Jacob at recess. Even Reverend Morrison, who had baptized both her boys, began delivering sermons about corruption that walks among the faithful, while staring directly at her pew. When she approached him, after one particularly pointed sermon, his response revealed the moral cowardice beneath his clerical collar. "Emily, I want to help, truly I do," Morrison said, wringing his soft hands. "But these are difficult times, complex situations that require wisdom, patience. My children need food and medicine, not patience, Reverend." Of course. But you must understand the church has obligations to the entire community. We can't be seen as taking sides in business matters. Taking sides. This is about right and wrong. Morrison's eyes darted around the empty church as if seeking escape. Sometimes what seems right to us isn't right in God's larger plan. Perhaps this trial is meant to teach you humility, to help you understand that pride goeth before a fall. Emily stared at him in disbelief. "You're blaming me for what's happening to my family. I'm suggesting that perhaps accommodation might serve you better than confrontation. Mr. Blackwood is a pillar of this community. Surely some arrangement could be reached." "What kind of arrangement did he offer you, Reverend?" Morrison's face flushed red. "I think you should leave now, Emily. Before you say something we'll both regret." The pressure mounted through October like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Blackwood's offers for her land became increasingly aggressive, each one lower than the last. When Emily refused, he would shake his head sadly and mention the difficulties of keeping up with mortgage payments. "Winter's coming, Mrs. Rowan," he said during one particularly unpleasant visit to her farm. "Harsh season for a woman trying to manage alone. Be a shame if something happened to delay your spring planting, or worse." Emily watched him from her porch, Samuel coughing weakly in her arms, while Jacob stood protectively beside her. Something in Blackwood's pale eyes reminded her of a snake she'd once seen coiled beside a rabbit hole patient, calculating utterly without mercy. "Are you threatening my family, Mr. Blackwood?" "Threatening?" His eyes widened in mock innocence. "My dear woman, I'm trying to help you avoid the threats others might pose. This territory can be dangerous for those who stand out, those who refuse to adapt to changing circumstances. And if I refuse your generous offer?" Blackwood's smile never wavered, but something predatory flickered behind his pale eyes. "Well, that would be your choice, of course. Though choices do have consequences. Sometimes consequences that extend beyond the person making them." As November arrived with its promise of bitter cold, Emily realized she was fighting a war on multiple fronts. Someone had poisoned her remaining cattle, leaving her with no source of income beyond the dwindling savings Thomas had left. The general store began refusing her business, claiming she was behind on payments Emily knew she had settled. Even the schoolmaster turned Jacob away, saying the boy was disruptive and unsuited for proper education. When Emily pressed for specifics, the man could only mumble about bad influences and the need to protect other children. The isolation was deliberate and complete. Every legal avenue was blocked, every potential ally turned away by fear or bribery. But Emily Rowan had been raised by a Methodist preacher who taught her to read scripture and shoot straight. Both skills had served her well on the frontier, and she wasn't ready to surrender either to the greed of lesser men. Late at night, when Samuel's coughing fits kept her awake, she would sit by the window and watch the hills above the valley. Sometimes she thought she saw movement in the shadows, a figure on horseback, patient as stone. There were stories about such figures. Legends of the old days when two peoples had fought and died for the same land. But what connection could those old stories have to her current troubles? And why did she find herself thinking about that mysterious letter hidden in Thomas's desk, with its cryptic reference to children's screams and unforgivable acts? As December approached with its promise of longer nights and harsher trials, Emily Rowan prepared for war. She had no allies, no resources, and no idea what she was truly fighting against. But she had something her enemies hadn't counted on the desperate fury of a mother protecting her young, and secrets from the past that were about to come calling. The ultimatum arrived on a Tuesday morning, wrapped in legal language and delivered by Sheriff Briggs himself. Emily stood in her kitchen doorway. Samuel balanced on her hip, while Jacob hovered near the woodpile, with the wariness of a young animal sensing predators. "Says here you got until Sunday to settle your debts." Briggs drawled his badge, catching the pale winter sunlight as he held out an official-looking document. "5 days, Mrs. Rowan. After that, the property goes to auction for unpaid obligations." Emily scanned the document with growing horror. The charges made no sense. Interest rates that violated territorial law, penalties for services, never rendered, fees for property maintenance she had never requested. The total debt exceeded her farm's value by threefold. "This is fraud," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. "That's a serious accusation, ma'am." Briggs stepped closer, his hand resting on his gun belt with practiced menace. "You calling Mr. Blackwood a liar? I'm saying this wouldn't hold up in territorial court. Good thing for you, the territorial judge won't be through till spring." Briggs's tobacco-stained smile was predatory. "Leaves us to handle things local-like, according to our own customs." Jacob stepped forward, his young fists clenched with righteous anger that reminded Emily painfully of Thomas. "You can't just steal our land. Boys got fire." Briggs observed his small eyes, never leaving Emily's face. "Be a real shame if that fire got him burned. Children can have accidents, you know. Especially children who don't learn to mind their manners." Emily pulled Jacob back, feeling the tremor of fury running through his small body. Samuel chose that moment to begin one of his coughing fits, the harsh sound echoing off the kitchen walls as his face flushed red, then began turning the frightening blue that spoke of failing lungs. "Please," Emily said, patting the baby's back desperately while he struggled for breath. "He needs medicine. Dr. Henley has laudanum that helps. Doc's not taking charity cases these days." Briggs interrupted without a trace of sympathy. "Professional liability concerns you, understand. Can't risk his reputation treating folks who might not be able to pay their bills." The message was brutally clear. Even medical care was being withheld as leverage. Emily felt something cold and hard settle in her stomach as she grasped the full scope of the conspiracy arrayed against her family. 5 days. Briggs repeated, touching his hat brim in mock courtesy. "After that frontier, justice takes its natural course. Hope you make the right choice, Mrs. Rowan, for the boy's sake." He rode away without looking back, leaving Emily standing in her doorway with a sick infant and a document that might as well have been her death warrant. That evening, Emily sat at her kitchen table trying to find solutions that didn't exist. Her savings were gone, consumed by fabricated debts and escalating harassment. She had no legal recourse, no allies in town, no way to prove the conspiracy against her family. She was still wrestling with impossible choices when Jacob crept downstairs, his nightshirt ghostly in the lamplight. "Mama, there's men outside again." Emily's blood chilled. She moved to the window and peered through the curtains at 3 riders sitting motionless at the edge of her property. They made no effort to hide themselves. This was psychological warfare, a reminder that escape was no longer an option. "Go back to bed, sweetheart," she whispered, though she knew the words were hollow comfort. "Everything will be fine." But even as she spoke, Emily knew they were lies. The riders remained for another hour before melting back into the darkness, leaving behind only the certainty that tomorrow would bring fresh horrors. Wednesday brought the first direct assault. Emily was hanging laundry when Jacob's shout from the barn made her drop the wet sheets and run. She found him standing over the bodies of their last 2 milk cows, throats opened with surgical precision that spoke of professional butchers rather than random vandals. A note was pinned to the barn door with a blood-stained knife. 4 days left. Next time it might be something you can't replace. Thursday's cruelty was more personal and more devastating. Emily walked to town, hoping to buy supplies with the last of her emergency money, only to find Martha Donnelly waiting behind the store counter with tear-filled eyes and trembling hands. "I'm sorry, Emily," Martha whispered, unable to meet her oldest friend's gaze. Orders came from the bank. No credit, no cash sales. Her voice broke as she continued. "I got my own children to think about. They said things could happen to families that help the wrong people." Emily left empty-handed, aware that every person on Bitter Creek's main street was watching her retreat, like spectators at a public humiliation. The isolation was complete. Now she and her boys were alone against forces that seemed to control every aspect of their former community. But it was Martha's next words spoken in a whisper, as Emily reached the door that would prove more significant than either woman realized. "Emily, be careful. They know things. About Thomas. About what he did before you knew him." Friday night brought the breaking point. Emily was awakened by Samuel's screaming, not his usual coughing fit, but the high-pitched wail of genuine terror. She rushed to his crib to find it overturned, the baby lying on the floor in a tangle of blankets, while a bloody knife jutted from the wooden boards, inches from where his head had been. Jacob's bed was empty. Emily snatched up Samuel and ran outside, calling her eldest son's name into the darkness. She found signs of struggle near the chicken coop, scuffed earth, a piece of Jacob's nightshirt caught on fence wire, and most chilling of all, small spots of blood leading toward the hills. Another note was nailed to her front door with a second knife. 2 days left. The boy's safe for now. Sign the papers and he stays that way. Refuse, and you'll find him hanging from the cottonwood like his father should have been. Emily collapsed to her knees in the dirt, clutching Samuel while her own desperate sobs mixed with the baby's cries. They had taken her firstborn and threatened her infant, leaving her completely alone against enemies who saw children as acceptable casualties in their war for gold and revenge. In that moment of absolute despair, Emily Rowan made the decision that would define everything to follow. She would not surrender. She would not run. If they wanted her land, they would have to kill her for it. But she would make that cost them more than they had bargained for. Standing in her doorway with Samuel in her arms, Emily lifted her face to the star-scattered Wyoming sky and called out a name she had never spoken aloud. "Blue Bear. If Thomas meant anything to you, if honor means anything at all, I need you now. They have my boy." The wind carried her words into the darkness, and somewhere in the hills, a nighthawk cried, once sharp and clear like an answer, or perhaps like a promise. Dawn broke gray and unforgiving over the Rowan farm, painting the frost-covered ground in shades that matched Emily's despair. Samuel had finally exhausted himself into sleep, but she didn't dare put him down after finding his crib violated by bloody threats. The memory made her stomach clench with fresh terror every time she looked at the knife holes in the floorboards. She had called for Blue Bear in the darkness, but received no response, except winter wind. Now facing another day of isolation and mounting fear, her desperate cry seemed like the delusion of a woman driven beyond reason. What made her think a Shoshone warrior would risk his life for a white family's troubles? But Emily had to try conventional help first, though every instinct told her it was futile. She wrapped Samuel in his warmest blankets and walked the frozen mile into Bitter Creek, her boots crunching through crusted snow, while hostile eyes tracked her from every window and doorway. Sheriff Briggs was drinking coffee behind his desk when she entered his office boots, propped up with casual insolence. He didn't look up when the door opened, though his slight smile suggested he had been expecting her. "Come to sign them papers, have you?" Someone took my son. Emily fought to keep her voice steady despite the tremor of exhaustion and fear. Jacob's been kidnapped. I found blood and threatening notes. That's so. Briggs finally looked at her with theatrical boredom, his small eyes glittering with malicious satisfaction. Got proof of this alleged crime. Emily placed the blood-stained note on his desk. Briggs glanced at it without touching it, then shrugged with practiced indifference that spoke of a man who had perfected the art of selective blindness. Could have written that yourself. Desperate folks do desperate things when they're facing eviction. Wouldn't be the first time a woman tried to gain sympathy with tall tales. My 12-year-old son is missing. Boys run off sometimes. Dangerous country for a child who don't know his place. Briggs leaned back in his chair, his meaning unmistakable. Course, if his mama was reasonable about her debts, I might be inclined to organize a search party. Might even find him safe and sound. Emily stared at him, seeing the casual corruption that treated her son's life as a bargaining chip in a game she was only beginning to understand. You're part of this conspiracy. Careful, Mrs. Rowan. Talk like that could be considered slander against a duly elected peace officer. Briggs stood slowly, his hand moving to his weapon with deliberate menace. Think you better go home and consider your situation real careful-like. Clock's ticking. Emily's next stop was the church, though she expected little mercy from that quarter. Reverend Morrison looked up from his sermon preparation with something that might have been guilt flickering across his soft, pampered features. Emily, I heard about your difficulties with young Jacob. Reverend, someone has taken my son. I need help finding him. Morrison set down his pen and folded his hands in a gesture of practiced sympathy that fooled no one. The Lord works in mysterious ways, child. Perhaps this trial is meant to teach you something about humility, about the dangers of pride. Humility. Emily's voice rose despite her efforts at control. My son has been kidnapped, and you're talking about character lessons. You've made powerful enemies, Emily. Sometimes the Christian path is to seek reconciliation rather than confrontation. Morrison moved toward the door, clearly eager to end the conversation. Turn the other cheek as our Savior taught. Forgive those who trespass against you. By surrendering my children's inheritance to thieves and murderers. Morrison's face flushed, but his voice carried the defensive whine of a man who knew he was compromising his principles for earthly security. You don't understand the complexities of the situation. Mr. Blackwood has been very generous to this church, very supportive of our mission. Sometimes we must accept that God's plan is larger than our individual desires. What did he pay you, Reverend? What's the price of a pastor's soul these days? I think you should leave now, Emily, before you say something that damages your already precarious position in this community. Emily found herself back on the street, abandoned even by God's supposed representative. Her final hope lay with Dr. Henley, but when she arrived at his office, she found a note tacked to the door. Gone hunting. Back indefinitely. The medical man who had delivered Samuel, who had sworn an oath to heal the sick, had simply disappeared rather than face the moral complexity of treating her family. Emily walked home through streets that had become enemy territory. Samuel growing heavier in her arms as the baby's breathing became more labored with each step. By the time she reached her farm, his lips were tinged blue, and his skin burned with fever that spoke of organs beginning to fail. She sat in her kitchen rocking Samuel while trying to think of options that didn't exist. She had no money, no allies, no legal recourse. Jacob was in the hands of men who had already proven their willingness to hurt children, and time was running out toward Sunday's deadline. That's when she heard the soft knock on her back door. Emily froze, clutching Samuel closer. 3 soft taps, a pause, then 2 more. A pattern that spoke of someone trying to avoid drawing attention from potential watchers. She crept to the window, seeing nothing but empty yard and dark trees beyond. The same pattern repeated, definitely coming from the root cellar behind the house, where Thomas had stored their winter vegetables. Emily grabbed Thomas's rifle and checked the load, then made her way outside with Samuel whimpering against her chest. The root cellar door stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness within. As Emily approached with her heart hammering against her ribs, a voice spoke from the shadows, low calm, speaking accented English, with the authority of mountains and endless sky. "Mrs. Rowan, I heard you call my name." Emily's knees nearly buckled with a mixture of relief and terror. "Blue Bear, your son lives, but we must move quickly if we want him to stay that way." A figure emerged from the cellar like a shadow given human form, tall and lean, dressed in worn buckskins beneath a dark wool coat. Blue Bear appeared to be in his 40s, with gray threading through long black hair and weathered lines around dark eyes that seemed to hold the accumulated wisdom of ages. He moved with predatory grace, every step deliberate and silent as death itself. "Where is Jacob?" "Hidden 2 miles north in the old mine shaft. They beat him, but his spirit remained strong." Blue Bear's ancient gaze fixed on Samuel, noting the baby's labored breathing with professional concern. "The child is very sick. Poisoned water. I can't get medicine. They've turned the whole town against us." Blue Bear nodded grimly, his expression suggesting he had seen this kind of systematic persecution before. "They mean to kill you all slowly. First, break your will, then take your land, then eliminate witnesses. It's an old strategy used by armies that understand the value of fear. Can you help us? I owe your husband a debt that can only be paid in blood." But the odds are harsh: 15 men against 1 warrior and 1 woman with a sick child. 15. Emily's heart sank at the number. Blackwood hired professionals from Denver. Gun hands who kill for money, not passion. They wait in the hills for Sunday's deadline. Blue Bear studied her face with those ancient knowing eyes. "You could still run. Take the children tonight and disappear into the territories. Start over somewhere. They'll never find you." Emily looked down at Samuel, then toward the hills where Jacob waited in captivity. Running would mean abandoning everything. Thomas had died for letting his killers profit from their crimes and escape justice entirely. "If we fight, what are our chances?" Blue Bear's smile was winter sharp and completely without humor. "Better than they think if you have the stomach for what war truly demands. These men expect you to break like other women they've terrorized. They don't know you carry warrior blood in your veins." Emily felt something fundamental shift inside her, the last traces of the civilized woman she had been falling away, like dead skin. In their place rose something harder and more dangerous, forged in grief and tempered by maternal fury that knew no bounds. "What must I do?" "First, we recover your son. Then we choose our battlefield and make them come to us on ground of our choosing." Blue Bear gestured toward the darkening hills. "Your husband knew this land's secrets. Time to use them against his killers." As night fell over the Rowan farm, Emily crossed a line from which there could be no return. She was no longer just a widow fighting for survival. She had become something her enemies hadn't anticipated: a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The war for Bitter Creek was about to begin in earnest, and it would be fought with the oldest weapons of all: courage, cunning, and the terrible justice that comes when civilization's masks finally slip away. The rescue unfolded in pre-dawn darkness, like a deadly ballet choreographed by shadows and steel. Blue Bear led Emily through terrain she thought she knew intimately, revealing hidden paths and natural cover that transformed familiar ground into a warrior's landscape of ambush and concealment. They moved north through the creek bottom, using the sound of running water to mask their footsteps, while Samuel rode against Emily's chest in a sling Blue Bear had fashioned from her woolen shawl. The Shoshone warrior carried no rifle, only a tomahawk at his belt and a long-bladed knife in his boot weapons that killed without sound or muzzle flash to betray their position. Now no guards posted. Blue Bear whispered as they approached the abandoned mine workings carved into the hillside like a wound in the earth. These men think like soldiers, not hunters. They trust in numbers and noise, not patience or wisdom. The mine entrance yawned black against the rocks, its timber supports rotting from years of neglect. Emily could hear voices echoing from within, harsh laughter and the clink of bottles. Her son's captors were drinking, celebrating their easy victory over what they saw as a desperate, helpless woman. 3 men inside Blue Bear reported, after a silent reconnaissance that left him invisible even to Emily's eyes. "Your boy is tied in the back tunnel alive, but hurt. 1 guard sleeps off his liquor. 2 play cards near the entrance weapons, close, but not ready." "How do we?" Blue Bear silenced her with a gesture, then melted into the darkness like smoke given human form. Emily waited, counting heartbeats, while Samuel stirred restlessly against her chest, fighting his own battle against the fever that threatened to claim him. Minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Then she heard it, a wet sound that might have been a sigh or a gurgle cut off almost before it began. The card game continued, players unaware that death had entered their sanctuary with moccasined feet and ancient skills. Silence stretched longer. Then a man's voice, thick with drink and growing concern. "Morrison, where'd you get to your deal?" Footsteps. A muffled curse that turned into something that might have been a scream if it had lasted longer. Then Blue Bear's voice pitched to carry just far enough. "Mrs. Rowan, bring light." Emily struck a match and entered the mine shaft, her makeshift torch revealing carnage that made her stomach clench despite the hardness grief had forged in her heart. 2 men lay in spreading pools of blood, and their throats opened with surgical precision that spoke of a lifetime's experience in dealing death. The 3rd cowered against the far wall. Blue Bear's knife pressed to his jugular with steady professional pressure. "Jacob," Emily called, rushing toward the back tunnel where her son waited. She found him bound with rope, his face swollen from beatings, but his eyes bright with unbroken determination. He had Thomas's stubborn courage, hurt, but not defeated, marked, but not broken. "Mama," he whispered as she cut his bonds with trembling fingers. "I knew you'd come. I never doubted." "The man who ordered this," Blue Bear said to their prisoner, increasing pressure until a thin line of blood appeared beneath the blade. "Name him, now." Blackwood." The gunman gasped, his eyes wild with terror as he stared at his dead companions. "Jeremiah Blackwood paid us good money to grab the boy, scare the woman into signing. Where are the others?" "Scattered through the hills watching your farm like hawks." The man's voice broke as he understood his situation fully. "Waiting for Sunday's deadline to move in for the final push. 15 men total, all professionals. You can't fight them all." Blue Bear studied the trembling captive with predatory calculation, seeing not just a man, but a tool to be used. "You carry a message to your employer. Tell him the Rowan family has protection now. Tell him every man who moves against them will join these 2 in death, but slowly. Very slowly. He won't believe. Show him proof." Blue Bear cut 2 fingers from the corpses, wrapping them in cloth torn from the dead men's shirts. His movements were matter-of-fact, almost casual, but Emily saw the cold fury burning behind his dark eyes. "Tell him this is what happens to those who hunt children in darkness. Tell him worse things happen to those who give the orders. They left the survivor alive, but thoroughly shattered a messenger who would spread word of their capabilities through fear, more effective than any bullet." The psychological warfare had begun. Blue Bear understood that terror could be as powerful as gunpowder if properly deployed against men who relied on intimidation themselves. The journey home took twice as long, with Jacob weakened by his ordeal, and Samuel's condition worsening with each passing hour. The baby's breathing came in ragged gasps, his skin burning with fever that spoke of organs beginning to fail. Time was running out on multiple fronts. "There's a Shoshone medicine woman 2 days north," Blue Bear said as they reached the farm, noting Emily's growing desperation as she tried to comfort her dying infant. She might save the child, but we don't have 2 days. Sunday's tomorrow. Then we make our stand here. Blue Bear surveyed the farmhouse and outbuildings with tactical eyes that saw fields of fire and killing zones where Emily saw only the remnants of her peaceful life. This ground can be defended if we're clever about it. Your husband chose well. They spent the remaining hours until dawn, preparing for siege warfare. Blue Bear revealed intimate knowledge of the property that shocked Emily. Hidden root cellars Thomas had dug, concealed rifle pits, even a tunnel connecting house to barn that Emily had never known existed. Your husband was a cavalry scout before he became a farmer. Blue Bear explained as they positioned supplies and ammunition in strategic locations. He knew this day would come eventually. The land is too valuable, the men too greedy. And he had enemies from his past who might come calling. Enemies. Emily's blood chilled as she remembered the letter hidden in Thomas's desk. What aren't you telling me? Blue Bear was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands steady as he checked rifle loads. Your husband wasn't just at Sand Creek, Mrs. Rowan. He served under a young lieutenant named Jeremiah Blackwood, a man who took pleasure in the killing, who went beyond even Colonel Chivington's brutal orders. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Blackwood knew Thomas before he came here. Thomas reported Blackwood's worst excesses to their commanding officer. Got him court-martialed and discharged in disgrace. Blackwood swore revenge, but the war ended and men scattered. It took him years to track your husband down. So this isn't just about railroad money. The railroad money made it convenient. But this is personal 20 years of hatred waiting for the right moment to strike. Blue Bear's dark eyes met hers. Your husband saved my life after Sand Creek helped me bury my family. He spent the rest of his years trying to atone for what he'd done. Now his enemy means to destroy everything Thomas built, everyone he loved. As Sunday's sun rose pale and cold over the valley, Emily stood in her kitchen, feeding Samuel drops of willow bark tea, the only medicine she could make from her own supplies. The baby's condition had stabilized slightly, but he remained dangerously weak, his breathing shallow and irregular. Jacob sat at the table methodically cleaning rifles despite his swollen hands, his movements showing a precision that spoke of hard-won maturity. The beating had marked him physically, but something deeper had changed as well. He was no longer just a frightened child. He was becoming a young warrior, tempered by violence and forged in the crucible of family loyalty. They come. Blue Bear announced from his position at the front window. Emily joined him, counting riders approaching from town. 15 men as promised, with Sheriff Briggs leading and Blackwood bringing up the rear on his fine bay horse. But these weren't just local toughs anymore. Half the riders wore the professional gear of hired killers, matched weapons, coordinated movements, the casual confidence of men who killed for money rather than passion. They spread out as they approached, forming a loose semicircle that blocked all obvious escape routes. Emily felt her heart sink as she grasped the tactical reality. Even with Blue Bear's skills and Thomas's preparations, they were vastly outnumbered by professionals who had done this kind of work before. But then she saw something that made her pulse quicken with unexpected hope. A second group of riders was approaching from the east, Martha Donnelly, leading what looked like half the town of Bitter Creek, their faces grim with belated determination. Blackwood saw them too, his pale face twisting with rage as he realized his carefully laid plans were unraveling. He spurred his horse forward, shouting orders that carried clearly across the morning air. Kill them all. No witnesses. Mrs. Rowan. Martha's voice rang out like a clarion call. We know the truth now. We found the letters. Emily's heart leaped as she saw her old friend leading the charge, Patrick Donnelly, beside her with an old military rifle. Dr. Henley clutching his medical bag like a weapon, even Reverend Morrison looking pale but determined. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they had finally found their courage. Briggs called out from 50 yards away. "Time's up, Mrs. Rowan. Come out with your hands visible and this ends peaceful." Emily stepped onto her porch, Samuel in her arms and defiance written in every line of her body. "This is my land, Sheriff. I'm not surrendering it to murderers and thieves. Then you're harboring a fugitive Indian. Send him out and we might show mercy." Before Emily could respond, Martha's voice cut through the morning air like a whip crack. "Coleman Briggs, you should be ashamed of yourself. This woman lost her husband and nearly lost her children, and instead of protecting her, you became part of the conspiracy against her. Stand down, woman." Blackwood shouted, his voice cracking with frustrated rage. "This is none of your concern. It became our concern when we found these." Dr. Henley held up a bundle of letters. "Correspondence between you and the railroad company detailing payments for driving families off their land, and we know what you really are, Jeremiah." Emily felt hope flicker in her chest, but Bluebear's expression remained grim. "Brave of them to come, but they're not fighters. And we're still outnumbered." "Last chance," Briggs shouted, drawing his weapon. "Stand down or face the consequences." That's when Bluebear made his presence known. A rifle shot cracked from an upstairs window, and the professional gunman closest to Briggs tumbled from his saddle with a hole through his chest. The others scattered, seeking cover behind trees and outbuildings, while their leader cursed and tried to restore tactical order. The siege of the Rowan farm had begun, but now it was no longer Emily and Bluebear against impossible odds. They had allies, however few and however inexperienced in warfare. For the next 3 hours, Emily's property became a battlefield, where two visions of frontier justice clashed with deadly force. Bluebear moved through the house like a deadly spirit appearing at different windows to deliver precisely aimed shots that kept the professional gunmen pinned down. Emily covered the rear approaches with steady rifle work, while Jacob loaded weapons and watched for flanking movements with the intensity of a soldier twice his age. The townspeople fought with desperate courage, but they were taking casualties. Patrick Donnelly went down with a bullet through his leg. The schoolmaster was struck in the shoulder trying to reach better cover. Even their brave intervention couldn't overcome the brutal mathematics of superior numbers and professional weaponry. Worse, Samuel's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The baby's breathing became increasingly labored, his skin taking on a grayish pallor that terrified Emily even as she fought for their lives. The stress of battle was pushing his weakened system beyond its limits. As afternoon shadows lengthened, the hired gunmen began their final assault. They had taken enough casualties to make them angry, and Blackwood was screaming orders that spoke of a man losing control of his carefully planned revenge. "Burn them out!" he shrieked from his position behind a fallen tree. "I want them to suffer like I've suffered." The professionals began setting fire to the outbuildings, intending to smoke the defenders out into the open, where superior numbers would tell. Emily watched her barn catch fire, the same barn where Thomas had once sat, bouncing Samuel on his knee, and felt something break inside her chest. But it wasn't despair that broke. It was the last restraint holding back 20 years of accumulated rage and grief. Emily burst from the house with a war cry that would have done her Shoshone ally proud, charging directly at Blackwood's position with Thomas's rifle blazing. Bullets whined past her ears, but maternal fury made her invincible. She had lost everything that mattered except her children, and she would die before letting these men take them too. The charge caught the gunmen by surprise. They had expected her to cower behind cover, not attack like an avenging angel with death in her eyes. Emily made it within 20 yards of Blackwood before a bullet took her high in the chest, spinning her around and sending her crashing to the ground. "Mama." Jacob's voice cracked across the battlefield as he saw her fall. Emily tried to rise, tasting blood and feeling her strength ebbing with each heartbeat. The bullet had done serious damage. She was bleeding internally, her vision blurring as shock began to take hold. But she wasn't finished yet. Blackwood emerged from cover, his pale face twisted with 20 years of accumulated hatred as he approached her with his pistol drawn. 20 years I've waited for this moment, Tom Hartwell's whore. 20 years of planning and patience. His name was Thomas Rowan. Emily gasped, her voice barely audible but carrying absolute conviction. And he was worth 10 of you. He destroyed my career, my reputation, my future. Blackwood's voice rose to a shriek. He turned me into a laughingstock, a cashiered officer with no prospects. I had to claw my way back up, had to become someone people feared because they wouldn't respect me. He reported you because you murdered children. Emily said each word costing her precious strength. Because you enjoyed it. I did what war demanded. I took victory from the savages who dared resist civilization. Blackwood raised his pistol, aiming at Emily's head. And now, I'm taking everything from him, just like he took everything from me. The gunshot echoed across the valley, but it wasn't Blackwood's weapon that fired. Blue Bear's rifle spoke from the burning barn, and the bullet taking Blackwood through the spine and dropping him like a felled tree. The banker's pistol flew from nerveless fingers as he crumpled beside Emily, his pale eyes already glazing with approaching death. Should have stayed in the east. Blue Bear said quietly, emerging from the smoke like an avenging spirit. Should have let the dead stay buried. The remaining gunmen, seeing their employer down and their tactical situation hopeless, began throwing down their weapons. Sheriff Briggs tried to rally them, but Martha Donnelly's rifle spoke from behind a water trough, putting a bullet through his shoulder that sent him tumbling from his horse. "It's over," Dr. Henley called out, emerging from cover with his medical bag. "The killing stops now." Emily lay in the dirt, feeling her life ebbing away as she watched the battle's end. They had won somehow, impossibly they had won. But the victory felt hollow as she realized she might not live to see her children grow up safe on the land Thomas had died to protect. "Mrs. Rowan." Dr. Henley dropped to his knees beside her, his experienced hands probing the bullet wound with gentle precision. "Hold on, Emily. You're hurt badly, but it's not necessarily fatal if we can stop the bleeding." Emily looked up at him through dimming vision, seeing genuine remorse in his weathered face. "Why now? Why help us now when you wouldn't before?" "Because Martha found the letters," Henley said, working to staunch the bleeding while he spoke. "Letters from Blackwood to the railroad company detailing his plans to drive you off your land. We realized what we'd become, what our fear had made us complicit in." Emily felt hands lifting her gently, carrying her toward the house where Jacob waited with Samuel in his arms. Her younger son was still breathing, still fighting his own battle against the fever that threatened to claim him. "Will they live?" she heard Martha ask, her voice thick with tears and guilt. "The baby needs immediate treatment for the fever," Henley replied. "And Emily. Emily needs surgery to remove the bullet and repair internal damage. But they both have a chance now. A real chance." As consciousness faded, Emily heard Blue Bear's voice speaking quietly to Jacob. "Your mother fought with honor, young warrior. She faced her enemies without fear and protected what mattered most. Your father would be proud." The last thing Emily saw before darkness claimed her was Samuel's face, pale, but breathing steadily in Jacob's protective arms. Her baby was alive. Her family had survived. Thomas's sacrifice had not been in vain. The war for Bitter Creek was over. The healing could finally begin. Emily woke to the sound of Samuel's laughter, a sound she had feared she might never hear again. Bright spring sunlight streamed through clean windows, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from the kitchen below. For a moment, she thought it might all have been a nightmare, but the aching tightness in her chest, where Dr. Henley had removed Blackwood's bullet, reminded her that the battle had been all too real. "Mama." Jacob's voice carried up the stairs, filled with joy and relief. "You're awake." Emily tried to sit up, gasping as pain flared through her torso. The bullet had done significant damage, but Henley's skill and Martha's nursing had pulled her back from death's threshold. She had been unconscious for nearly a week, fighting fever and infection while her body slowly healed. "Easy now." Dr. Henley said, appearing in the doorway with his ever-present medical bag. "You're on the mend, but you need to take things slowly. That bullet came within inches of your heart." Jacob entered carrying Samuel, who reached for his mother with chubby arms and clear eyes. The fever that had nearly killed him was gone, broken by medicines Henley had finally provided and constant care from the women of Bitter Creek, who had taken shifts nursing the Rowan family back to health. "How long?" Emily asked, accepting Samuel into her arms and marveling at how healthy he looked. "2 weeks since the battle," Jacob replied, settling beside her bed. "Dr. Henley says you almost died twice, but you're too stubborn to stay dead." Emily smiled despite the pain, looking at her eldest son and seeing how much he had grown in such a short time. The boy who had been kidnapped and beaten had become a young man tempered by hardship but not broken by it. What happened to the others, Briggs the gunman? Federal marshals came a few days after the fight. Jacob explained. They arrested everyone who was still alive. Briggs is going to prison, and the railroad company is paying damages to all the families Blackwood drove off their land. And Blue Bear, Jacob's expression grew thoughtful. He stayed until he was sure you'd recover, then headed north. Said his debt was paid, but... The boy paused, glancing toward the window. "I think he'll be back. He left something for you." Jacob produced a carved piece of bone traditional Shoshone work, depicting a warrior and a mother standing together against enemies. It was beautiful and meaningful, a testament to the alliance that had saved their family. "There's more," Jacob continued. "Martha wants to see you when you're strong enough. She has things to say, apologies to make." Over the following days, as Emily slowly regained her strength, the full scope of the community's transformation became clear. The people of Bitter Creek, shamed by their complicity in Blackwood's conspiracy, had thrown themselves into making amends with an energy that bordered on desperation. Martha Donnelly was the first to visit, her face etched with guilt and genuine remorse as she sat beside Emily's bed. "I nearly let them kill you," Martha said without preamble, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I knew something was wrong, knew Blackwood was threatening families, but I was too scared to act. Too concerned with protecting my own children to help yours. You came when it mattered most," Emily replied, though she couldn't entirely hide the hurt in her voice. "You found your courage when we needed it. Too late. Nearly too late." Martha wiped her eyes, her voice growing stronger. "But we're going to make it right, Emily. All of us. The whole town is working to rebuild what Blackwood destroyed." She wasn't exaggerating. Over the next month, as Emily recovered enough to move around her house, she watched in amazement as neighbors who had turned their backs on her family worked tirelessly to repair the damage. The barn was rebuilt bigger and stronger than before. The poisoned well was cleaned and restored. Even the school welcomed Jacob back with apologies and extra attention to make up for lost time. Reverend Morrison proved the most surprising penitent. The soft-spoken pastor who had abandoned her in her hour of need appeared at her door one afternoon with his hat in his hands and shame written across his features. "Emily, there are no words for what I did. What I failed to do." His voice trembled with genuine emotion. "I let fear overcome faith, let worldly concerns corrupt my spiritual duties. I betrayed everything I claimed to believe in." Emily studied his face, seeing a man genuinely broken by his own moral failure. "What do you want from me, Reverend?" "Forgiveness, if you can find it in your heart. And the chance to prove that I can be better. That we all can be better." Morrison's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I've resigned my position here. I'm going to work with the territorial government to ensure no other community faces what Bitter Creek became. It's not enough, but it's a start." The man who had preached about turning the other cheek while doing nothing to help her family was transforming himself into an advocate for frontier justice. It was a kind of redemption Emily hadn't expected, but found herself able to accept. "We all failed you," Morrison continued. "But you showed us what real courage looks like, what faith in action actually means. I want to spend the rest of my life trying to live up to that example." As spring turned to summer, the Rowan farm became something more than just a family homestead. It became a symbol of resistance to the kind of corruption that had nearly destroyed their community. Families who had been driven from their land by similar conspiracies came seeking Emily's advice and support. She found herself becoming an unofficial advocate for frontier justice, working with territorial authorities to expose and prosecute land-grabbing schemes throughout Wyoming. Blue Bear returned in midsummer, arriving quietly, as was his way, but staying longer than before. He had accepted an official position as an Indian agent, using his understanding of both cultures to prevent the conflicts that had torn the frontier apart for so long. "Your husband would be proud," he told Emily, as they sat on her rebuilt porch, watching Jacob teach Samuel to walk in the evening sunlight. "He spent his life trying to atone for Sand Creek. You've turned his sacrifice into something that protects others." "Do you think he found peace?" Emily asked. "Before he died?" Blue Bear considered the question with the gravity it deserved. "He found purpose. He found love. He built something good from the ashes of what he'd helped destroy. That's more than most men achieve, whatever their past sins." That evening, as Emily tucked Samuel into his new crib, built by hands that had once been turned against her family, she reflected on the strange turns their lives had taken. They had lost so much, but they had also gained something precious in the knowledge that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the cost. Jacob, now nearly 13 and wise beyond his years, joined her as she stood watching Samuel sleep. "Mama, do you ever think about leaving, starting over somewhere new?" Emily considered the question seriously. The memories here were painful: Thomas's death, Samuel's near-fatal illness, the battle that had nearly claimed them all. But those same memories were also a precious part of a story that defined who they had become. "This is our home," she said finally. "This is where your father built his dreams, where you boys were born, where we learned what we're really made of. We don't run from our history, we learn from it and build something better." 6 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Emily stood in the Bitter Creek Cemetery beside a new headstone that read, "Thomas Rowan, beloved husband and father who found redemption in love." The marker stood next to a smaller stone commemorating the victims of Sand Creek, placed there at Blue Bear's suggestion as a reminder that healing required acknowledging all of history's wounds. Jacob, now tall enough to look her in the eye, stood beside her with Samuel in his arms. The baby who had nearly died was now a healthy, laughing toddler whose bright eyes reflected the same stubborn courage that had carried his family through their darkest hour. "What do we do now, Mama?" Jacob asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had grown up too fast but retained the essential goodness that defined him. Emily looked out over the valley where Thomas had built their dreams, where evil men had tried to destroy them, where good people had finally found the courage to stand up for what was right. The land was theirs now, free and clear, protected by law and community commitment. But more than that, it had become a symbol of hope for others facing similar struggles. "Now we live," Emily said simply. "We remember the past, but don't let it define our future. We help others who face what we faced, and we make sure your father's sacrifice means something for generations to come." As they walked home through the autumn sunshine, Emily felt the presence of something she had thought lost: forever peace. Not the naive peace of ignorance, but the hard-won peace of someone who had faced the worst the world could offer and emerged stronger on the other side. The story of the Rowan family would continue, written in the lives of children who grew up knowing that courage and justice were more than words carved into the character of a community that had learned the true meaning of neighbor, preserved in the memory of a Shoshone warrior who had honored friendship above tribal loyalty. Thomas Rowan had found his redemption in love and sacrifice. Emily Rowan had found hers in the courage to fight for what mattered most. And their sons would carry that legacy forward, ensuring that the light kindled in darkness would never be extinguished. The war for Bitter Creek was over. The peace they had won would last as long as people remembered the price of freedom and the courage required to defend it. In the distance, a hawk circled high above the valley, its cry carrying on the wind like a blessing from the infinite sky. Emily Rowan listened to that sound and smiled, knowing that she had earned the right to believe in tomorrow.